Hi guys, it's vf.miniatures Warhammer Tactics series, and today I decided that it's time to address the less experienced layer of players and point out some things that I've noticed them doing in games during my relatively extensive history of 40k tournaments. So without further ado, let's start. The first thing, and probably one of the most important ones, is not doing your homework. It doesn't matter if you are planning to attend a tournament or you just want to show a good result in a friendly game of 40k, you should know your army rules thoroughly. It's one of the first hints that show me that player is perhaps less experienced is when I ask them a question about their army. They can't really give me a straight answer and they need to look in the book and check something twice over to have a clear and concise answer. And knowing your army rules includes, of course, the unit abilities, some things that are unique about the units that you've chosen to have in your army, the detachment abilities, the rules that your detachment, your faction provide for your army, your relics, of course, that you took, and warlord traits. And the next part of this tip is selecting your secondaries beforehand. You should have at least some idea of what you think your army is capable of doing in terms of secondaries on the battlefield, because trying to select them right at the table in front of your opponent is very stressful, can be very stressful for young and inexperienced players. And it causes a lot of mistakes usually. Of course, before the game, you usually don't know who you're going to be facing, and you don't know the layout of the battlefield, what is the layout of the terrain, but you should have at least a resemblance of an idea of what your army is capable of doing in terms of secondaries. Almost the same rule goes for your units. You should know the potential of your stuff in your army. So you should know whether you should charge something or you probably need to stay away. Whether your squad can really do damage to a potential heavy threat, or it's better to leave them behind an obscuring terrain. These are the things that you need to think about before the games and usually at home when you're playing your list. Another thing I found to be very useful is thinking about the stuff that you really don't want to encounter in a tournament or in a game with your friends. So whether it's a whole faction or some particular type of a unit. And usually these are the things that will make the most trouble for you. And if you prepare for them, at least mentally prepare for them in advance, it will be easier to deal with them. Sometimes, of course, you miscalculate and the things that you were afraid of come out to be something that is easy to deal with, and the stuff that you thought you will be dealing with very easily is actually the stuff that makes the most trouble for you. But these are the things that come with experience. Next tip is called move first, think later. It's a pattern of play that I see in a lot of new and inexperienced players. When their turn comes, or if it's their first turn in the game, or maybe their opponent's turn has passed and it's now their turn to go ahead and move their models, they rush into the movement phase before thinking what and why they should be moving, because they want to look as if they had a plan, when actually they don't have a plan at this moment in time. When you touch your model, you should have a good idea of what you are going to be doing with it, whether you are going to move it towards the enemy, away from the enemy, or you should stay still with this model, because many units in the game benefit from staying still actually. For example, the heavy weapons on the infantry squads. Bolter discipline allows you to fire rapid-fire weapons for the full distance. The Tau Storm Surge battle suit that allows you to reroll hits if you do the action, and so on and so forth. So some things should not be moved at all unless you really need to. Ask yourself, what does it do for me? What advantage does it provide me with? And if you don't have an answer, think about it some more. But if your brain is completely frozen, and it sometimes happens because tournaments or sometimes even games with your friends can be very stressful, and if you just can't find a good solution for some unit that you have in your force, decide between three possible options, only three options. Stay still with the squad. What can it help you achieve staying still with that unit? Move towards the enemy. Perhaps it's a close combat unit and you need to cross the board in order to charge something. And move away from your enemy. Hide behind cover or get into cover to have +1 to your saving throw, and etc. These are your 3 options. If you only consider these 3 options, it will probably be easier for you to decide what you should do with that particular unit. Of course, one thing that I really love about Warhammer is that there are actually hundreds, maybe thousands of ways you could have used that unit instead of only these 3 options. But when your brain is frozen, sometimes it's easier to just skip those hard, tough decisions and decide between the 3 easier options. It's especially important if you are attending a tournament where the chess clock is used, and I know that some tournaments use them, and I actually play most of my tournaments with a chess clock, and when your timer is counting, it's even more important to know what your priorities are, because spending 10 or 15 minutes of your precious time thinking about a squad that will probably not affect a game in any serious way is a real waste. It's actually one of the very common ways that newer players lose to more experienced players in tournaments. They just run out of time. And when your clock is at 0, in most tournaments, you just can't do anything else in that game. You can only do like simple stuff like saving throws. You can't even move your models. You can't use stratagems. You are basically out of the game at this point. So that's the stuff that you would probably want to avoid. Next tip is called "I'll use this just because I can." Again, a very common thing that I see newer players do. They have a stratagem in their book, or they have a relic, or an ability, once per game usually ability, on their unit. And whenever they have the first chance to use it, they try to use it because they think that they will not be a better moment in the game. Or perhaps they just want to do something cool as fast as possible. And where in games where you just want to have fun, it may be a good way to go. In the games where you are aiming to win that game, I would recommend to think twice before doing stuff like that. You need to know why you want to use that stratagem. You need to know what this relic will provide for your army at this point in the game. In terms of stratagems, you may need those command points right in the next turn, and you won't have them if you spend them like on a 3 command point orbital bombardment stratagem that will do 1 or 2 mortal wounds to your opponent, and they will just grin and laugh in your face because you won't have command points for example, the counteroffensive stratagem when you need to fight with your unit next before your opponent has a chance to strike at them. And have your main goal in mind. I don't mean the goal of winning the game because it's too broad. I mean the goal of that certain point of the battlefield. What are you trying to do here? What are you trying to do in the corner? What are you trying to do near that objective? What are you trying to do in your opponent's deployment zone? Think about those things and you will probably have a better picture of whether you should or shouldn't use that stratagem, relic, etc. Next tip is called giving your units away for free. It's very closely related to the second one where you think that you need to do something. I'm sure that this psychological pattern is called illusion of action. So you have, for example, an infantry squad in your army and you have moved your elite forces, you have moved your tanks, your heavy support units, and everything in your army, and you know what you are going to do with them, but you have that infantry squad in your midst that is just standing there and you don't know what to do with them. And most of the players, younger players, newer players, they decide that it's wise to just advance that squad forward right to the center of the board, and who knows what will happen next. Maybe there will be some useful thing that this squad can do for them in the next turn. And sometimes there is, but in most cases that squad just gets wiped out by a lucky couple of shots, or maybe it provides an enemy unit with a target for a far-1 charge. And with this tip, as with the move first, think later, I recommend to leave that squad, for example, behind cover and give your opponent a chance to provide you with the use for that squad. Because in many cases, when the next turn comes, your next turn comes, you will have a much better understanding of where you should reinforce your fronts. Maybe some unit needs help on an objective, or your opponent has deployed a unit in your deployment zone behind your lines, for example, a deep striking squad to steal your objective, and you can engage them with that particular infantry unit that we are imagining here in this tip. So don't fall for the illusion of action pattern, because it's a thing that in most cases will not do you any good. If you don't have a clear purpose for that unit, something that you can use them for, leave them in behind cover, leave them somewhere safe, and wait for the perfect opportunity to use them in the game. And the next tip is called not asking the right questions. Again, very common for the newer players when they meet someone at the table and they don't know the army, they don't know what the relics do, what the units do. They only ask like 1 or 2 questions about the most prominent stuff on the table in your opponent's tray, for example. The armies are usually carried in trays in tournaments if you have never attended them. And these are 4 questions that I recommend to ask when you see some army that you really don't understand. 4 main questions. What relics do you have, and what do those relics do? What warlord traits do you have, and what do those warlord traits do? How fast can your army get to me? And it involves advancing and charging, redeploys, some abilities that allow units to come from reinforcements right at on the first turn, and range and firepower of the main guns in their army. So how far do the main guns shoot, and what those guns are? So what is their strength, AP, and damage? What maybe stratagems can the opponent use on them? What are the main powerful things that they can use? For example, like increase the amount of shots, or +1 to wound for bolters in the Thousand Suns army. Main stuff. There are usually 1 or 2 or maybe 3 things tops that the opponent can use on the guns to make them more powerful. And if you are fast enough, and if your opponent knows what they are doing, you'll probably only spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about that, but at the end of those 2 or 3 minutes you will have a very good understanding, if you are listening carefully, of what your opponent can do to you in the first turn at least. And that's the information that you really need to have a good deployment plan for your army. For example, if they don't have any good guns, you can not worry about hiding your stuff behind obscuring terrain and just leave them in the open. It's a very rare occasion, but sometimes that happens. Or in the other case, where your opponent's force is very fast, like Quicksilver / Demons fast, and you need to measure how far those units can go, how far the fastest Keeper of Secrets can go with all the advances and charges and all that stuff, calculate the threat range and deploy accordingly. Many new players have this habit, and even more experienced players have a habit of just hiding everything on the first turn, because sometimes, and for some armies, there is no disadvantage in hiding something behind the obscuring terrain, but some armies and many units and many armies have a very clear movement disadvantage if they are in cover behind the terrain. So you need to, for example, if you're running a lot of dreadnoughts, which many people do nowadays, if you hide a dreadnought behind an obscuring terrain ruin, you will need to move to the side in order to clear the wall of the ruin, and then only then move forward, which will steal those precious inches from your movement characteristic, and sometimes it may be very important for the game. So if your opponent doesn't have a lot of guns, or perhaps their guns are too short ranged and they won't be able to reach you in the first turn, it may be more beneficial to leave your dreadnoughts in the open, just calculating how far you need to deploy your main assets, instead of hiding behind the terrain and suffering from the consequences. Next tip is very easy and again extremely common, is forgetting about your primary scores. Half of your points come from the primary objectives, and staying on those objectives and keeping your opponent away from those objectives is one of your main goals throughout the games. Your home objective, or in some deployments objectives plural, must always be occupied and defended. Of course, some missions allow you to move away from those objectives while still controlling them, but in many cases it's a trap and a way to lose a lot of points. Because it's very easy to miscalculate and simply forget about some enemy unit in a ruin that can simply advance on that objective and claim it for themselves. Another common problem and a part of this tip is controlling objectives with units that die to a stiff breeze. Surely you don't want your elite and heavy units to be sitting on the objective the whole game bringing you points. You need those in your front lines, but you should have a clear understanding of how much firepower and how much onslaught can your objective holders deal with before they give up on that objective. It's very dependent on your terrain layout. So if your objective is behind a ruin and you can hide the squad inside a ruin out of line of sight whilst they are still controlling that objective, it'll probably be enough for you to leave a 5-man squad of something there to control that, unless your opponent has a lot of out of line of sight shooting, in which case you need to have a backup there. But if the objective is somewhere in the middle of nothing and there is no cover there, nothing to hide behind, you should be aware that your opponent will be able to shoot at that unit that is controlling the objective. Will they do that? It depends on how well you'll be playing, because you may saturate them with so many threats that they will simply have no time to react and shoot at the stuff that is just sitting in your back lines. But that's a topic for another more advanced discussion. Next very common problem is shooting stuff that you can charge. I think that I've seen hundreds of people do that in games. They move out their heavy guns, they move forward with their combat units, and in their shooting phase, which obviously comes before your charge phase, they just obliterate whatever is in front of them. Paying no attention to the stuff in the back lines. And when it comes time to charge, they don't have any real targets for their melee unit. The mistake here is obvious. You should be maximizing the potential of each of your units. So whenever you can shoot, you should do that, and whenever you can charge, you should do that as well. But when you shoot, think about the stuff that you will be charging, because if you don't have the targets, you will miss out on the whole fight phase, on the extra movement that the fighting gives you with all those charge moves, pile-ins and consolidations, which sometimes can win you whole games. Yeah, this one is as old as time. When your charge phase comes to an end and you see your opponent smiling at you like, I got you, man, with that kind of a smile, it means that you have missed a heroic intervention. Of course, in many cases when you are playing a friendly game, you can be forgiven for that and you will be given a chance of moving your units in a different way. But in a tournament, you can't really rely on that. So you should be always checking and double checking, asking couple of times which units in your army can make a heroic intervention. How far can they do that? Some units can do a typical 3-inch heroic intervention, and some have potential of 6-inch heroic interventions, like the Space Wolves characters, for example, or any Space Wolves units for that matter with the use of a stratagem. All Custodes units can make a heroic intervention with the Fraternity of Heroes stratagem, and so on and so forth. A lot of units that aren't characters can make heroic interventions. And I found that in many games it happens at the end of the game, when the players get tired and they stop thinking about that stuff, and that's actually where it often matters the most, because the points swings at the end of the games can be the most devastating. So be aware of the heroic interventions and ask your opponents the right questions. And this tip is very closely related to the second one. Again, wasting your precious time. And if you need to play a couple of games, say if you are in a tournament setting or you want to play a couple of games with your buddies in a single session, this stress and your mental agility can really go down quite easily, especially if you let yourself think about the stuff that is not the priority at the moment. And the way I think you should deal with that is setting a deadline. So if you need to decide something very important in the game, for example, you have 2 targets to shoot at with your main guns, and both of them are a big threat, and you need to deal with them, but you understand that probably you won't have enough firepower to deal with both. You need to choose one. And very often people start to overthink. They start to linger on the thoughts and waste the time that is, in many cases, very limited. And even when the time isn't limited, like in a home play setting, you really don't want your opponent to be sitting there for an hour whilst you are deciding between shooting at one tank or another. So set yourself a deadline. It should be a clear, defined amount of time. 2 minutes, 10 minutes, it doesn't matter, but it should be a finite amount. And when the deadline comes, if you don't have, and it will be in some cases, if you don't have a better option between the two, decide randomly. Just roll the dice and do whatever the dice says, because wasting more time and more brain energy will probably mean you losing that game for one reason or another. Either because you have run out of game time or because you are simply too exhausted to think about the things that are really important in your next turns. And the last tip, and probably the most important one, along with the first homework tip, is not giving up or giving up in the case of a mistake. There will be some games where you get absolutely smushed in the first turn and you would think that there is no way out of this apart from conceding. But I assure you, in 50 to 70% of the cases where you think that there is no way for you to win the game when this or that happened right in the first turn. For example, your main unit was deleted from the board. There is actually a very real chance for you to win that game, even though you have lost a very important part of your army, or maybe a half of your army even. In most cases, when you have lost such a big part of your army, you have already made a very big mistake. But who doesn't make mistakes? We all do make them. And the thing that sets apart an experienced player from a new one usually is being able to adapt to the changing situation on the battlefield. Because in many cases, your opponent have already also made a mistake at some point. Perhaps they have overcommitted their forces to some flank, and the other one is not protected, and you can easily push them in that direction and clear them from all of the objectives and charge them with your slow but extremely powerful units and delete whatever has just attacked your forces and blunted some of them. And your counterattack may be even more devastating than the stuff that your opponent has done to you in the first turn of the game. And even if this won't happen and you still lose the game, you will have much more experience and much more great ideas about the stuff that you would perhaps want to change in your army roster than if you had quit trying right from the start. I have played a lot of games in tournaments where some very experienced players have decided for themselves that the game is lost and there is no chance for them at all. And when they did that, that was actually the moment they have lost the game. Not when I have done something to their forces, destroyed some part of their army. The moment they decided for themselves that there is no way they can fight out of this was the actual moment of their loss. Because they have stopped fighting and trying to win at this point, because this is a game of dice and you don't know what will happen next. There may be an extreme, an obscene streak of luck waiting around the corner, and all you need to do is just simply wait for it to come your way. But if you start doing stupid things and just throwing your units at your opponent, giving them some target practice, that's where you actually lose. So you should be doing your best in each of the games, trying to overcome the situation against impossible odds. I think I start to sound like some Space Marine captain before a very important planet drop. So I think you got the general idea. Don't give up. So that's it, guys. I hope this video was useful for you. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Have fun playing 40k, and I'll see you next time.